This is part 3 of Your Life is Not an Accident, and we're going to focus on what is evolution's mechanism. How does it do it, and why it won't work? And we're also going to look at deliberate misrepresentations in high school and college textbooks. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of evolution, we have to talk a little bit about junk DNA. And the reason why is evolutionists have been using this for the past 20 or 30 years. Basically what they're talking about is between the genes are large sections of DNA that don't code for proteins. And on this chart here, the yellow is the coding and the red is the non-coding. And so the coding that actually makes the proteins that builds the structures of life is only about 10%. So they thought this 90% was junk. It was like the vestigial organs that are useless and left over. Francis Crick said much of the DNA is little better than junk. That was over 30 years ago. Richard Dawkins said, worldwide atheist, non-coding DNA was the result of evolutionary drive to survive, despite being biologically useless. He went on to say, what pseudogenes, which is junk DNA, are useful for is embarrassing creationists to make up a convincing reason why an intelligent designer should have created a pseudogene. Ha ha. Well, there was a 9-year project on DNA research called the Encode project. 442 researchers from 5 countries. The U.S. cost alone was $185 million in this 9-year research. They published their findings on September 5th, 2012. What they found was 80% of what was thought to be junk is very active, that it contains 4 million switches that turn genes on and off. And these switches work differently in various kinds of cells. They've only unlocked or scratched at the surface. They acknowledge they've only unlocked 10% of the secrets. The Encode project writes eulogy for junk DNA, declared Science in that month. And that pretty much ended that. I guess creationists might go hee hee. Junk DNA helps regulate biological function, including keeping your heart beating. Now just imagine if the scientists did not have such a predisposition of an evolutionary bent to have used this as a defense for evolution, and if the past 30 years we could have been searching for a purpose of this. So how does evolution work? First of all, it assumes a highly complex cell has already appeared by chance. That's kind of like the Steve Martin joke. You know how to become a millionaire? Well, first you get $1 million, and then that's what evolution assumes. First you get, by natural process, a very complex cell with information already encoded in it. Now, before we get into the mechanism, most people haven't connected this with evolution, but National Geographic and all throughout the scientific literature, there have been mass extinctions in the Earth. More than 90% of all organisms that have ever lived on Earth are now extinct. And National Geographic went on, in a handful of times in the last 500 million years, 50 to 90% of all species on Earth have disappeared in a geological blink of an eye. The causes of these events are unsolved mysteries. Here's kind of like what it looks like. The first one at the bottom, number 1, happened 440 million years ago. 85% of living species were wiped out. The next one happened right when the fishes, 75% wiped out. Then number 3, 90%. So only 10% of the living species survived then. And then number 4, 200 million years ago, when the dinosaurs were starting to be developed, 50% was wiped out. And the last one was 66 alleged million years ago, in which 75% were wiped out, including all the dinosaurs. So the question, and this is a separate presentation on what happened to the dinosaurs. The real question is not only the dinosaurs, but every other animal. So in order for evolution to work, you have to understand that, you know what, most of your ancestors were wiped out. So they focus on these ancestry kind of proofs to show that we had a common ancestor instead of really explaining how it is done. They want to avoid the genetics, which is the heart and soul of evolution. They focus on embryonic recapitulation. We'll talk about that. Vestigial organs. The asterisk is they are never used in debates, these arguments. They're only in textbooks and in our culture. The fossil record. Interpretative drawings. Homologous structures. We'll get into that. And ape DNA similarity. The embryonic recapitulation embryos retrace their evolutionary history as they develop. And Ernest Haeckel here shows, look at the human as compared to the fish and the salamander and the bird as they develop. Well, these are Haeckel's actual drawings, and they were proved fraudulent over 50 years ago by Sir William Hiss. Here's what they actually look like in that stage of embryo development. And he also said that the folds in the human embryo look like gills and like we were fish, but they're not gills. They're folds, and it has nothing to do with the respiration system. It's the thymus gland, middle ear, and the parathyroids. Then he also said, look, we've got a yolk sac like a chicken. It's not a yolk sac. Everybody knows it's the blood sac that provides blood for the developing fetus. And third, look, he has a tail, a coccyx. It's not a tail, it's the end of the spine. The spine has to end somewhere, and everybody knows this. But in your biology textbooks, you see instead of Haeckel's fake drawings, it's replaced with similar artwork, but the message is the same. Here's an honors biology book in Rancho Cucamonga, and it shows fish, reptile, bird, human, gill slits, tail. Our embryos show our evolutionary history. No evolutionist would ever use this in a debate because it's been discredited. Critics point out error in textbooks, so they acknowledge that. And Nature, to make the young embryos look more alike, Haeckel removed the limbs from various embryos. This article was about it's still appearing in textbooks. And when people talk about evolution being true, as this writer did, they use these arguments, vestigial gill slits, and man and ape share 98%, which we'll cover. You won't believe how many times I've talked to people and they still believe in this gill slits and embryo recapitulation. Even Time magazine joins in the disinformation. Inside the womb. Look what this is. At this point, a human looks no different from a pig, chick, or elephant. All have a tail, yolk sac, and rudimentary gills. Nothing could be further. You can Google this yourself. Don't take my word for it. In 1971, the encyclopedia said that there were 100 vestigial organs left over in man. The appendix, tailbone, tonsils, pituitary gland, body hair, adenoids. All of these have been shown to have a function. The appendix is a part of the immune system as well as tonsils, and it has good bacteria that recharges the body after dysentery. National Geographic in March 2010 said vestigial organs not so useless after all, study finds. But here is my son's high school biology textbook. On the left is the coccyx, where the finger is pointing to is what's called the tailbone. No function. We have a set of miniature tailbones at the base of our spine, which obviously no longer support a tail. But then you go to any Gray's Anatomy and Physiology, and on the exterior, the backside, you see ligaments on the backside being attached to the end of the coccyx. And then on the interior side, we see muscles and tendons all attached to the point to hold the pelvis girdle together, so to speak. And then if you go to Gray's Atlas of Anatomy, where the red arrow is, that's the tip of the coccyx, we see the organ of the anus and the sphincter muscle attached to the very tip. Now, both textbooks can't be wrong. One is evolutionary propaganda, the other is a scientific statement. They've been dissecting cadavers for, over 500 years? They know that these muscles and tendons are attached there. They also use the fossil record. In order for Darwinian evolution to be true, there should be numerous transitional monsters as one animal changes into another. In 1980, they had the world's top paleontologist. A paleontologist is somebody who's a fossil expert. And Science, number one science journal in America, the problem, according to most of these fossil experts, is that the principal feature of the species in the fossil record is stasis. In other words, stationary, not change. Newsweek, the more scientists have searched for transitional forms between species, the more they've been frustrated. Even Richard Dawkins indicates regarding the fossils, and we find many of these fossils already in advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appear, it's though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, the appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. But our high school textbooks, that up in the corner says this: evidence from the fossil record indicates that modern-day birds, mammals, and reptiles descended from reptilian ancestors. Here's again, this biology high school book says the evidence in the blue for microevolution is extensive. The fossil record provides a clear record of continuous evolutionary change, just the opposite. They also rely upon interpretative drawings. Well, you can take a cat and through a series of different drawings show that it eventually evolved into a baseball catcher. The horse is a famous one. The family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in textbooks. This is what a lot of the paleontologists say. What about homologous structures? They point that we must have a common ancestor because look, the bone structure in the forearm, 2 bones in the wrist, from a bat to a bird to a whale, are all the same. We see this trumpeted in the museum. What does this have to do about genetics? Well, genetics has a response to this. Here's another high school textbook of the same thing. For a common ancestor to be true, structures have to be created by either similar cells in the embryo or programmed by similar genes that would be passed on to each generation. They have known for over 50 years that structures created by different cells and genes are in different kinds of animals. So it's not from the same embryo cells or the same genes, and this fact is left out of high school and college textbooks. Sir Gavin de Beer in 1971, he's a British evolutionary embryologist, director of museum in Britain of natural history. He wrote Homology, an Unsolved Problem. And he stated over 40 years ago, it's now clear the inheritance of these homologous structures from a common ancestor was misplaced. For such inheritance cannot be ascribed to the identity of genes. The attempt to find these common ancestor type of genes, except in closely related species, has been given up as hopeless. Now, what about man and primate? We still hear this today, that we share 99% the same. This first appeared based upon estimates in 1986 from Richard Dawkins' chimpanzees, and we share more than 99% of our genes. It wasn't until 15 years later that the first time of the human genome research was announced and completed. And it wasn't until 4 years after that that the chip genome DNA research was published. So this statement came out 15 years before the human genome was even completed. In that same year, this peer-reviewed biology journal did a study of that, and they found of the total number of gene sequences, 33, one-third of the initial chimp DNA data was not used, as it did not align to humans. Further study on this is that the more accurate estimates is that our similarity between apes and chimps is between 81 to 88%. But that's not that critical. It doesn't show a common ancestor. We have similar structures. And a banana has 50% similarity. It's not just the DNA. It's how the genes are regulated by those different switches and codes. But this disinformation still continues. Here's Science, June 13, 2012, 7 years afterwards. Ever since scientists sequenced the chimp genome in 2005, they have known that humans share 99%. Still is repeated. So here's the question. Let's get into evolution and we'll conclude here. Do natural processes by themselves have godlike creative abilities? There is no natural process that is self-organizing. All of the natural laws of science shows that things go from order to disorder, a wearing out, a running down. The first one that Darwin introduced, and he knew nothing about genetics, was natural selection. And this is a process that does eliminate existing animals. It doesn't create new ones. Actually, the fittest don't necessarily survive because small animals and weak animals survive. Really, it's the animals that reproduce the most that have a better chances of survival. But this explains the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. This is kind of a cartoon of how it works, as wolves are finding the slowest and the weakest lamb to go after a sheep. But here it is an example, just to show you how it works. Here are two medium-hair dogs. They have the long gene from one parent and the short hair gene from the other, so combined they would produce typically medium hair. They mate, and different combination, variation, which is true, could produce in a litter long hair, medium hair, and short hair. And let's assume there was 5 years of a harsh winter or ice age or whatever, and all of the medium hair and short hair died out. So all that was left was the long hair, and they reproduced, and we now have all long-haired dogs. This is natural selection in action. We have, notice no new genes were added. Notice we have a loss of genetic information. Now in this dog pool, we don't have the short hair trait. Notice there's fewer varieties, and if things warmed up, they're less able to adapt. Notice that there's been a major reduction in the population pool for future evolution to even take place by this process. So natural selection eliminates, but it does nothing to the genetic code, and it doesn't create. So they introduced genetic mutations. They have to do something to the DNA, and they say these are copying errors when DNA makes a new strand before the cell divides. Our observation, and I have to be sensitive to this because they are destructive. They're the cause of diseases, cancer, and birth disorders. Thank goodness they're rare. There's two major categories of mutations. There's what you inherit from a parent, and that's in every cell for the rest of your life. And then it's what you acquire during a person's life through copying errors of yourself. That's not passed on to the next generation unless present in the parent's egg or sperm cell, that mutation. Now here is evolution's mechanism. they believe when those copying errors are made, although 99.9% are destructive, there are on occasion beneficial mutations. And then of those that are not fit, natural selection will get rid of those. Now, just to kind of show you, here's a codon or a code for lysine, AAG, and let's say there was a mutation on the G and an A was copied. Well, AAA also can code lysine, so that would be a silent. Nonsense would be if the first T was copying error became, the first A became a T, and TAG is stop. So that would cause a stop in that protein and would create nonsense. The third is if the A in lysine in the middle became a G, it would become AGG, and that would produce a different amino acid. The protein would fold differently and would lose its function. Now, the advocates of evolution say that natural selection eliminates harmful mutations in the library, in our DNA. Not true. Natural selection never sees the mutation. It wipes out the entire organism and its entire genome when the organism is wiped out. Now, what they're saying is you can take the first electronic game created in 1972, pretty simple, Pong, the ball goes back and forth, and through random copying errors within the program language of Pong, you're going to eventually end up with John Madden football with 32 teams and a whole ton of information that never existed in Pong. Well, let's ask ourselves, do beneficial mutations ever occur in life? Because the first living cell is caused a mutation, and everything is built up by mistakes. When that fish was formed, it wasn't a pure DNA. It was filled with mistakes and went on to make further mistakes. Well, Jerry Bergman, 7 advanced degrees, PhD in biology and measurement, and over 100 scientific papers published, did a study of if there are beneficial mutations. He researched biological abstracts that's published over 4,000 journals internationally. It's a research literature. He found research on 170,000 mutations, and out of those, claimed to be beneficial was 98. That's 0.01%. And all of these mutations described to be beneficial resulted in a loss of information. He then went to Medline. It's the search engine for the U.S. government, and he found research on 283,000 mutations. Claimed to be beneficial, 88. Less than 1/3 of 1%. And again, all the mutations resulted in a loss of information. So then he looked to see what were some of the examples given. They gave seedless watermelons. If you use gout medicine that you put on a flowering watermelon, it'll become sterile. It's convenient for us, but the watermelon can't reproduce. So that's not a more complex watermelon. They also use the flightless cormorant. The normal cormorant is in the upper left and big wingspan and flies and can dive for fish. The mutation caused the wings to shrink and made the bird unable to fly. It gave him an advantage that he could dive deeper without bigger wings, but he's not more complex. He's actually a broken version of the normal cormorant. The Belgium blue cattle was given, and a mutation in the cow produced 25% more muscle and less fat. That was good for the farmer. It wasn't good for the cattle because it reduced the fertility, which would be bad for its survival. The Encode sheep. The normal sheep is on the top, and your Encode sheep with the short, stubby legs are on the bottom. Darwin used this in his book Origin of the Species to show evolution in action. And the mutation produced these short legs, and the farmers bred them because they didn't have to build high fences. They couldn't jump very well. Problem is, this mutation also caused cartilage damage throughout the sheep, and the sheep went extinct. Bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics. Here's on the left, the blue is the bacteria, and that's kind of like its cell wall. There's a receptor in cell wall, and the antibiotic binds with it. And again, proteins and bind based upon their shape. A mutation would cause, as you can see, the binding area broken, and so it would be impossible or difficult for that antibody to bind. And so that keeps it from not being killed by the antibody, but that break keeps that bacteria from having other functions from happening. So it's not to the bacteria's advantage long term to have a broken cell wall. And finally, the last one that was fruit flies, mutants. Their lifespan is 40 days. Females lay 500 eggs. Since 1906, scientists have used X-ray to force mutations by 15,000%. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years and generation through this process. After that period of time, they've produced only 400 mutational features. Not one can be called a new species. As you see some of the examples, cut wings, broken wings. These mutant flies are weaker, and when they compete with normal flies for food, natural selection kills them off. After all of this time, if evolution is true through mutations, the fruit flies should be looking at us through the microscope instead of the other way around. So evolution is a fairy tale. There's not a scientific evidence to really support it. It's a lot of posturing and strong, persuasive language. The creation model said that animals were created by kinds with different DNA. And that's what we see. We see different characteristics, different structure, different systems than all of these. And then they reproduce according to their kinds. Living things are not just complicated. They look as though they're beautifully designed machines. So even the evolutionists say, gee, what we see, there is an appearance. And I've used Dawkins a lot because he is the world spokesman for atheistic science. But to his credit, when he was asked how certain on a scale of 1 to 7 he was, if there was no God, with 7 being, I'm certain there's no God, he said a 6. He recognized that only a person with infinite knowledge of the universe could state there is no God. Francis Crick said, because biologists must constantly keep in mind, because what they see and what's apparent to them with their own eyes was not designed, but evolved. This is the only scripture I'm going to use because this presentation is for a lot of people who are skeptical about the claims of the supernatural. It's in Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, as Francis Crick and Richard Dawkins sees, being understood from what has been made, what the creation is out there, so that men are without excuse. So what this is saying is there is no godlike creative process, because if there was, men are without excuse. Thank you for watching Surfing and DeepThoughts.com, and please feel free to Google and research all of the claims made in part 1, 2, and 3. Thank you.